Hi and welcome to this video, which is all about my slot A Athlon 600 today. So it's in this kind of blue case, which I don't like, and it's all bendy and wobbly and horrible. And then I've got this really chunky, solid beige case that I plan to move it into, and also to seek out a decent graphics card for it. So that's what this video is going to be all about. Some of you may remember having seen this before, because I did do a video when I first got the motherboard and the processor. And at the time I said I didn't really like this case. You can see I've got some little sort of bits of tape on the feet there to try and balance it out a bit more, but I didn't like it. People suggested putting a plank of wood or something in the bottom here to try and stabilize it. I am actually going to use this case for something. I've got a plan for it, but it's not a nice case, it's cheap. So let's get it opened up and get the innards out. I love these big chunky processors. I think they had to do it this way because at the time they couldn't figure out a way of integrating the cache onto the die directly. So they had to put extra chips on to a board and then attach everything into a sort of cartridge like this. The 600 megahertz one came out in 1999, cost the princely sum of $699, and it has a bus speed of 200 megahertz with a multiplier of 6 and 512 kilobytes of level 2 cache. And the code name for the model was Argon, I think, the core, and it's sometimes referred to as the Athlon Classic, I think, this one. And then the cartridge was done away with, and we got the Athlon Thunderbird shortly after. So it was a lot to get excited about at the time. I mean, look at this, hot Athlon mamas, 2 contenders to court your Athlon lovin'. Got some benches from a magazine here as well, and yeah, it looks like it performed really well. Look at it, it's gone right off the edge of the page, totally outperforming the Pentium 3. It wasn't all roses though. Some magazines didn't give it a particularly good review at all, or maybe it's just the manufacturers and the components that were used, but I still love them anyway. So the motherboard is a Gigabyte GA71XE. Couldn't find a lot of information about this online. All of the manuals and everything are there, but I was looking for reviews and stuff to see what people thought, but there isn't much going. But it seems like a solid enough board. There isn't much to it. There's a set of dip switches for processor speed, and that's pretty much it. So this is a fairly simple bit of the video, just getting this into its new case before we have a look at graphics cards. So yeah, that's what we'll do next. Get the new case out, open it up, and put everything back. Onwards to graphics, we've got a slightly mad motley collection of cards here, just anything that was kind of vaguely period correct from my collection that I thought might be good to look at. All of these cards are 64 megabytes apart from one, which we'll get to in a minute. There's a couple of Power VR cards. We've got a Cairo and a Cairo 2. As far as I'm aware, the only difference really between these two cards is the Cairo 2 is higher clocked. And both of these are interesting because the architecture is totally different to anything else in the way that it renders. And they have some kind of funky software transformer lighting. They don't have hardware transformer lighting. These are interesting cards. We'll be doing a video about these at some point. Next up, we've got a couple of GeForce 2s, and we've got a GeForce 2 Ti and a GeForce 2 MX 400. Obviously, the MX is a hobbled version of the Ti. Ti's got 4 pixel pipelines, MX has got 2, and various other sort of power saving and lower clocks and things like that make the MX a slower value option in the GeForce 2 range, but it'll be interesting to take a look at them both nevertheless. There's a Radeon 7000, and this was a cut-down version of the first Radeon GPU. This doesn't have hardware transformer lighting either. It also only has a 64-bit bus. I believe the rest of these cards have 128-bit, and generally a budget card, but because it's based on the original Radeon architecture, I kind of thought it was more or less period correct here, around 2000, so we'll give this a go as well. And finally, there's a GeForce 4 MX 440. Again, this is based on GeForce 2 architecture, even though this came out in 2002, but it kind of makes it period correct based on architecture from around about 2000. This is a much more advanced card though. It's 8 times AGP, and it's got 128 megabytes of RAM, and it's got all sorts of other bells and whistles like better color depth and so on. It's higher clocked than even the GeForce 2 Ti, and it has some advantages over it, but again, it's an MX, so it's been hobbled. It's only got 2 pixel pipelines, so it'll be interesting to see how they compare. Okay, get the machine ready to do some benchmarking then. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to run 3D Mark 2000, and then I'm going to run the Dungeon Siege benchmark. Then I'm going to run the Unreal Tournament time demo, and then I'm just going to try a bit of general gameplay with Fraps running, and we'll see how they all get along. First up is going to be 3D Mark 2000. So the plan is to run it for each of the cards in turn, but the Kairos I'm going to run twice. So I'm going to run it once for each without the software transformer lighting, and then I'm going to run it again with the software transformer lighting and see how that performs. So off we go. Done this 1,000 times, and we'll see how the results come in. The results are in, so let's go through them left to right. The first card was the GeForce 2 MX 400, and that scored 2,852 3D marks. Next up, we had the GeForce 2 Ti, which performed, as you'd expect, better, 3,726 3D marks. Then we had the Radeon 7000, which performed pretty poorly, which kind of expected, 2,134 3D marks. Then we had the Cairo, which did pretty damn well actually. It beat the GeForce 2 MX 400. It got a score of 2,905. Then when I applied the software transformer lighting, it took a hit. So that was 2,483. So it lost about 300 3D marks for the overhead of the software transformer lighting. Then the Cairo 2 did even slightly better. So the Cairo 2 did 2,981 3D marks. And when I applied the software transformer lighting, it also took a hit of about 300, and it scored 2,525. Then finally, we had the GeForce 4 MMX 440, and that was blistering. It beat the Ti, and it got 3,925 3D marks. So there's some interesting things there. So the Kairos are, at least in 3D mark, are pretty much on a par with the GeForce 2 MX 400, and that is the exact card that it was kind of up against at a similar price point. These were sort of budget cards, and so that was pretty good performance from the Cairo. And the software Transformer Lightning, because it's a CPU overhead and this is not a particularly fast CPU, you can imagine how that might sort of come into its own a bit with a faster CPU. So something to explore in the future. But if it was just going off these 3D Mark scores, the GeForce 4 is definitely the card in the lead at the minute, and slightly behind it, the GeForce 2 Ti. Kind of expected that would be the case, but the Kairos are okay. On to the Dungeon Siege benchmark. Now this brings graphics cards to its knees. I've seen a lot of stuttering and struggling cards when I've used this in the past, so I'd be interested to see. It's a bit later as well. It came out in 2002, and I think in the box it has DirectX 8 included, so all of these cards are DirectX 7, and even then, apart from the GeForce 4, of course. So it'd be interesting to see how they cope with this. And there you go. You can see frame rates are pretty low across the board for this one. So GeForce 2 MX400 scored 19.94 average frames per second this is. The GeForce 2 Ti did slightly better and scored 20.35 frames a second. The Radeon performed dismally and scored 14.83 frames a second. And the Kairos, again, are kind of holding their own. Look at that. The Kairo, 19.63 frames a second, so just a fraction of a second behind the GeForce 2 MX. And with this was a weird one, because with the software transformer and lighting in this benchmark, it actually increased. So you get 20.74 frames a second, so you kind of got an extra frame and a half per second out of that software transformer and lighting. So I don't know quite what's going on there. Kairo 2, again, 19.11 frames a second, so actually slightly slower than the Kairo there. Not sure what was going on there. And again, with the software transformer and lighting, you got 20.49 frames a second. So in this benchmark, bizarrely, the Kairo 2 is slightly slower than the Kairo, and the software transformer lighting actually increases performance a little bit. The GeForce 4 MX 440 was a no-show because of this, and I actually tried two totally separate cards, so I guess it's possibly a driver thing, but I wasn't really that bothered to be going and finding new drivers because I probably didn't want to put this card in here anyway. But yeah, this is what happened. It was a bit of a mess, so I didn't bother benchmarking any further with that. But yeah, they're interesting results again, and I was expecting the GeForce 2 Ti to be more performant than that, at least further away from the GeForce 2 MX400, and surprised that the Kairos keep up pretty much with both of them. So interesting. And then the old usual, the Unreal Tournament time demo. So let's see how they get on with this. Now, the results of this were kind of more the pattern that I was expecting. So the GeForce 4 MX400 got average frames of 52.11. The GeForce 2 Ti was about three frames a second ahead, which I still would have thought would be more. But the GeForce 2 Ti got 55.03 frames a second average. The Radeon was less, as you'd expect, 46.65. Kairo, neck and neck with the GeForce 2 MX400 again, with 52.7. The Kairo, with its T&L turned on, was pretty much the same, 52.23 frames a second. Kairo 2 on its own, 53.2, so slightly ahead of the MX400 and the other Kairos, and with its software T&L turned on, it went up to 54.33, so that was nipping on the heels of the GeForce 2 Ti. So I don't know, these results are all over the place. How can you draw a conclusion? Now, it is possible, well, it's doubtful that it could be bottlenecking on the CPU, I suppose. It could be bottlenecking on the CPU, because they're all in the ballpark, but there are differences. But in some of the other benchmarks, especially the Feature Mark 1, there were significant differences, so I'm not sure. You might also notice there's no score for the GeForce 4 MX440 because there's definitely something going on. I tried 2 separate cards with the Dungeon Siege one and it failed on both. Did the same here. It was running this, but it was running it at about 14 frames a second. So I've no idea what's going on with these two games, though the cards seemed perfectly happy in 3D Mark. So who knows? It must be drivers. That was pretty much it for the benchmarking, so all I did was run a bit of gameplay in Fraps, just to try and get a real-world feel if any of these cards felt any different to each other at all. And to do this, I chose Star Wars: The Battle for Naboo. Not a game that I'm particularly familiar with, but just looking at the back, so it's well within the processor spec, and it has a nice selection of supported 3D cards, including the Kairos, so I thought this might be quite a little test just to see what some casual gameplay feels like. So I basically just played the same level again for each card and each scenario and ran Fraps. So for all of the cards, this game was pretty playable. I don't think it was a particularly demanding game. It was quite fun. I was getting quite good at it by the end of this because I spent so much time playing it. But we started off with the GeForce 2 MX400, and that was getting mid-30s to very early 40s, so kind of 35 to 41 was kind of the range that I was seeing there. And the TI was a definite step up. The TI was mostly in the high 40s and 50s and even got up into the 70s at some points, so that is, you're definitely seeing the benefit of all those extra pixel pipelines. And a Cairo did damn well in this game. The Cairo was nipping at the heels of the MX400. I think it even exceeded it in a couple of places where it went into the 80s, but it was generally in the mid-50s. So yeah, highly playable. Cairo 2 is very similar again. So we're in the mid-50s and early 60s most of the time, and highly playable. And yeah, I like these cards. And then we get to the poor old Radeon 7000 that really struggles with its single pixel pipeline. So it was playable enough, but you're looking at 20s and early 30s for this. So by far the worst card of the bunch. By this time I was so sick of the GeForce 4 MX440 I didn't even bother trying. Anyway, enough of all of that crappy benchmarking. Let's do something fun and stick some badges on this box. So this has the original small computer manufacturer badge on the front, integrated system peripherals, so I'm going to leave that on there, but I shall cover it with a Geek and Spiel AMD Athlon badge, and then of course one of those fantastic retro inside badges as well, just to make it look fantastic. So the point of all of that was I don't really know, to be honest. I think that there was some bottlenecking going on with some of these games where they were coming up with very similar scores. And to be honest, I think apart from the Radeon, any one of these cards would do fine in this machine and possibly even be wasted. So I don't think I want to put my GeForce 2 Ti in here, keep that for something better. And I could have put the MX400 in there, but even that's a sort of handy card to have for maybe a slightly faster machine. I'm going to put the Cairo in, not the Cairo 2, just the normal Cairo, and live with that for a little while. I'll probably be whipping those two cards out later on for a bit more of a look at them and some of the fancy features they have to try and compensate for their lack of raw horsepower. I think that pretty much wraps it up for this video. I've enjoyed messing about with some of these cards that I haven't really played with very much before, and I was talking to some people on Twitter and they said that a sort of machine like this, then people mentioned Voodoo 5s, people mentioned TNT 2 Ultras, people mentioned Radeons, the original Radeons, and things like the GeForce 265. So I think I've got a gap in my collection I need to perhaps fill with a few of those kind of cards for this kind of machine. But it was fun checking them out anyway. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it, and I hope you'll join me for the next video and consider leaving thumbs up and comments and all that kind of stuff. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you later.